On a Tuesday morning in August 1944, in a field outside the village of Sintos in Falaise region of Normandy, a Tiger tank commander named SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Whitman drove his vehicle out a tree line and into the open ground on the northern edge of the Camp Falaise road. He had 138 confirmed tank kills to his name. He was 30 years old. He was the most decorated tank commander in the German military, the recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the man whose destruction of a British armor column at Villers-Bocage in June had made him the subject of newsreels and propaganda features across Germany. His Tiger moved approximately 400 meters into the open field before the Shermans of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers found it from 3 directions simultaneously. The exact sequence of what happened next is disputed among historians. Whether it was a single Sherman Firefly round from close range or 3 or 4 standard 75mm rounds from multiple directions or a combination of fire from Typhoon aircraft that was operating in the area. What is not disputed as a result? The Tiger burned. Whitman and his crew were killed. He was buried where he fell and not identified for decades. This video is not about Whitman. It is about a man who served alongside him in the 2nd SS Panzer Division Leibstandard, whose name appears in far fewer books and whose story is far less familiar, and whose experience of tank combat in the 4 years between the invasion of France and the collapse of the German front in the West reveals something about the nature of sustained killing that the celebration of figures like Whitman, the aces, the decorated champions, the subject of the newsreels, has systematically obscured. His name was Ernst Bauer. He destroyed, by confirmed count, 117 Allied and Soviet tanks between 1940 and the autumn of 1944. He survived wounds on 3 separate occasions. He held the Iron Cross 1st and 2nd class and had been formally recommended for the Knight's Cross twice, with both recommendations delayed in the administrative backlog that characterized the final year of German military decoration processing. And in October 1944, somewhere on the retreating Western Front east of the Belgian border, he stopped firing his main gun, not because the gun was broken, not because there were no targets, not because he had been ordered to stop. He simply stopped, and when his loader asked him why, he told him he was done. The human capacity for killing is not infinite. This is a fact that military history has documented repeatedly across every culture and every era that has produced sustained infantry and armored combat, and that military psychology has studied with increasing precision since the experience of the Second World War forced the professional acknowledgement that what soldiers experienced in combat was not simply fear and exhaustion, but something more specific and more damaging that required its own language. The language that was available in 1944 was inadequate. The German military had a concept called Kampfmüdigkeit, combat weariness, that was used to describe soldiers who had become unreliable in the line after extended exposure to combat. The concept was clinical in the sense of providing a category, and punitive in the sense that extended Kampfmüdigkeit, if it resulted in behavior that could be classified as cowardice or insubordination, was addressed through the military justice system rather than the medical system. Of the approximately 22,000 German soldiers executed by military courts during the war, a substantial proportion had committed offenses that modern psychiatry would classify as manifestations of untreated combat stress reaction. But the phenomenon that the language of Kampfmüdigkeit was inadequate to describe was something different from simple weariness. It was a specific psychological consequence of sustained killing, not being killed, not surviving being nearly killed, but being the instrument through which killing was repeatedly accomplished that had been, in the tank combat environment of the Eastern and Western fronts, compressed into a form more concentrated and more immediate than almost any other combat role in the war. A tank commander in a Tiger or a Panzer Fort did not kill abstractly. He aimed. He calculated range and deflection. He ordered the shot. He watched through his gun sight as the round struck the enemy vehicle. He watched the fire begin. He sometimes watched the crew attempt to escape. He sometimes watched the crew not attempt to escape, and understood what that meant. He did this dozens of times, in some cases hundreds of times, over a period of years. The psychological literature on what this does to the human being who does it is extensive, consistent, and almost entirely absent from the popular histories of the tank aces whose kill counts are cited with the same reverent precision that sports statistics receive. Ernst Bauer had, in 4 years of sustained armored combat on 2 fronts, killed in the specific and direct way approximately 117 times. Each of those 117 represents a vehicle that he aimed at, that he ordered shot, that he watched burn or stop moving or explode. Each of those 117 is likely to have had a crew of 2 to 5 men. The arithmetic of what Bauer had participated in, rendered in human terms rather than in vehicle count terms, is staggering. What happened to Bauer in October 1944 was not a single event with a single cause. It was a culmination of a process that his crewmates, who had served with him for the previous 18 months, later described as something they had observed building over a long period without having the language to name what they were watching. The crew noticed, first, that Bauer had begun to hesitate between the order to fire and the shot itself. Not a hesitation that affected accuracy or that showed up in any formal evaluation. He continued to destroy targets, continued to make correct tactical decisions, continued to demonstrate the reflexive combat mastery that 4 years of survival had built into his responses. But there was a new second between the command and the execution that had not been there before. A pause at his loader, who knew his rhythms with the intimacy of men who share a very small space in very dangerous conditions, felt as something like a hell breath. The loader, in testimony he gave to a German military historian in the 1970s, described the pause in terms that are simple and precise. It was as if he was asking the target's permission, not consciously, not in any way he would have put into those words. But the pause had the quality of a question before an answer, and the question seemed to be something about whether this particular tank, with this particular crew, needed to be the one that he destroyed. The second thing the crew noticed was that Bauer had stopped talking about the kills the way he had talked about them earlier. In 1942 and early 1943, on the Eastern Front, there had been a specific language in the crew for acknowledged kills, brief, professional, without celebration but with kind of athletic satisfaction that was normal among men competing in a dangerous enterprise at which they were very good. By 1944, the language had stopped. Confirmed kills were reported up the chain in the formal notation required by doctrine, but within the crew, they had ceased to be acknowledged. The third thing was the dreams. Bauer did not tell his crew about his dreams, but he slept badly enough, and on enough occasions murmured or said fragmentary things while asleep that were recognizable as related to specific engagements, that they knew the dreams were happening. Dreams in which several of his crewmates inferred from what fragments they heard he was on the other side. When he stopped firing in October 1944, the specific circumstances were these. His tank was in a defensive position behind a hedgerow on a road east of Brussels. A British Cromwell tank appeared on the road approximately 400 meters to his front, within easy killing range, at an angle that his gun could engage without moving the hull. His gunner called the range and bearing. His loader reported the gun loaded. Bauer looked through his sight. He did not give the order. The Cromwell moved through his sight picture and continued down the road, disappearing around a bend. Bauer watched it go. His crew waited. He said nothing for a period that his loader later estimated at approximately 2 minutes. Then he said, "I am done." What Bauer meant by done, and what his crew understood him to mean, was not that he was abandoning his post or refusing all military duty. He continued to command his tank. He continued to navigate to position, to direct the crew in their defensive responsibilities, to report accurately on enemy movements and positions. He continued to function as a professional soldier in every respect except one. He would not give the order to fire the main gun. His crew, who had been with him long enough to understand what they were watching, covered for him. When situations arose where fire was clearly required and clearly justified, the gunner fired on his own initiative, within doctrine, since gunners had independent authority in certain immediate threat situations, and the crew managed the paperwork in a way that attributed kills to vehicle category and engagement without specifying precise command sequence. Whether this arrangement reached the attention of higher command is not clear from the documentary record. What is clear is that Bauer remained in command of his vehicle for the remaining weeks of his active service. He was wounded for the 4th time in November 1944, in a manner serious enough to require evacuation from the front line, and he spent the remainder of the war in a military hospital and then in convalescence. He survived. He went home to Bavaria in 1945. In the post-war interviews he gave, sparingly and only to people he trusted after extended conversation. He was asked about his record, about his 117 kills, about what it had been like to be one of the most effective tank commanders on the Western Front. He said that he had been asked before by people who wanted the war story in the form they expected it to take. He said he was not interested in giving that version. He said that the number 117 was not a measure of his skill. It was a measure of something else. And he was not going to specify what, because if the person he was talking to could not already feel what it was, no explanation would produce the feeling. He said one more thing, which the historian who recorded it preserved verbatim. He said, "The pause before I stopped was the most honest thing I did in 4 years. The pause was me asking myself whether the thing I was about to do needed to be done one more time." And one morning in October, the answer was no, not because it was strategically unnecessary, not because the war was lost, simply because I had asked the question enough times, and the answer had been yes enough times, and it was not going to be yes one more time. The military history of the Second World War had produced an extensive literature on what it calls the tank aces, the decorated commanders whose kill counts are cited in books and documentaries and commemorative accounts with the precision of batting averages. Michael Whitman, Otto Carius, Kurt Nispel, Ernst Bake. The names are well known within the community of military history enthusiasts. The numbers attached to their names are cited frequently and reverently. The experience that produced those numbers and what that experience cost the men who accumulated them receives almost no attention in the same sources. Bauer's story is not the story of a man who broke down. It is the story of a man who, after 4 years and 117 vehicles and all the arithmetic those numbers contain, made a decision that was completely lucid and completely honest, and that reflected a form of moral reasoning that the military system he served had no category for, and that the popular celebration of the tank aces has no language for. He stopped because he was done, not because he was weak, not because he lacked courage. 4 years and 117 kills, and 4 wounds established that beyond any reasonable challenge. He stopped because he had reached a specific point that the literary tradition calls a moral limit, and that the clinical tradition calls a breaking point, and that Bauer himself called, simply and accurately, done. The British Cromwell that drove through his sight picture in October 1944 and continued around a bend, and presumably survived to fight another day, was carrying a crew that never knew how close it had come and what had happened on the other side of the hedgerow. The men in that Cromwell came home. Whether Bauer ever thought about them specifically, or whether they were simply the moment when his accumulation became complete, is not known. What is known is that he let them go, and that in letting them go, he revealed something about the nature of what he had been doing for 4 years that the number 117 will never capture, and that the Knight's Cross recommendation that came through in December 1944, after he was already in hospital, did not acknowledge. He was, in the specific language of the system, a hero, and he was also a man who had reached the end of what he was capable of doing, not as a soldier, but as a human being performing an act that human beings are not designed to perform without limit.